From the streets of Miami to the inaugural BMF champ of the UFC, Jorge Masvidal has had a career that has endeared him to millions. But here's why many of his fellow fighters have every reason to be scared of him. Jorge Masvidal's career has truly been a story of two distinct halves. During his earliest years, he was a highly underrated talent, a technical marvel that many fans and analysts would single out for this watertight skill set. But at a certain point along the way, Jorge started to really string things together. After spending most of his career in the lightweight division, Masvidal stepped up in weight and started to really put it together as a welterweight. After stepping away from the sport for a while, the dude just seemed to find something within himself, and all of a sudden, he was just a totally different presence within the sport. If you want to know why these fighters were scared of Masvidal, well, let's start with his self-proclaimed resurrection. If you're a fighter in their mid-30s, chances are you probably have a solid idea of who you are in the fight game. And yet, when faced with a major crossroads in his life, Jorge pulled off one of MMA's all-time great U-turns. He stepped away from things for over a year, grew out his hair and beard, packed on some muscle, and returned to the cage as a new man. And it wasn't just that Jorge was clearly more driven. There was a confidence to him, a desire to get truly violent in there. That really stood out. Masvidal was a fighter reborn, but he also had a decade-plus career already behind him. So his opponents not only knew they were facing an incredibly confident and revitalized Jorge, but they also had to contend with his years upon years of high-level experience. Jorge's later years showcased the perfect balance between octagon comfort and raw fury. Masvidal in the past had let quite a few close decisions go against him, just because he didn't quite have that extra gear in his game. Well, this version did, and it was almost as if he managed to finally channel that Street Fighter violence in him once again. Because, lest we forget, Jorge's fellow fighters have another good reason to fear him because of his roots as a street fighter. This guy originally shot to fame when videos of him fighting in organized backyard brawls went viral, showcasing his raw fighting talent. These fights were, of course, organized by Kimbo Slice, a man who would also end up in MMA. And during this time, Masvidal honed his stand-up and clinch games into something truly lethal. He wasn't always necessarily fighting guys in his own weight either. No, Jorge was so good that he was basically fighting dudes much larger than him, and more often than not, he was having tremendous success there. So by the time the switch to MMA happened, Jorge was already seasoned in no-holds-barred fighting, skilled in the art of unarmed combat. And for Jorge, despite having achieved great levels of fame and exposure, the dude has never forgotten who he is. In fact, Jorge takes his upbringing so seriously that he is still liable to run up on someone in the streets if they cross him. Jorge Masvidal once famously said of his upbringing on the streets, "You learn to have a really good sucker punch and a really good 50-yard dash." Well, as it turns out, Jorge lives up to his word on this one. In the last 5 years alone, Masvidal has attacked two different members of the welterweight top 5. First, he hit the future champion Leon Edwards with a 3-piece and a soda, an infamous moment that has since been immortalized in MMA pop culture. And then last year, any doubts about the legitimacy of his rivalry with Colby Covington were definitively stomped out when Jorge ran up on Colby outside a Miami restaurant and sucker punched him. Say what you want about that on a moral level, but it certainly proves one thing beyond any doubt. Jorge Masvidal can be relied upon to back up his words, to live up to his reputation. The dude was raised on the streets, and his nickname Street Jesus didn't happen by accident. But even if you stay on good terms with him, you'll have to contend with one of the most well-rounded fighters in the sport today. Forget about all the extra stuff, the trash talk, the mental warfare, the potential for a fight in the streets. When those cage doors close, Jorge Masvidal is one supremely well-rounded fighter in there, and his ability to use his expert boxing, his lethal kicks, his superb wrestling, and underrated Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Yeah, it really does make him a tough fighter to game plan for.
We're not in the same playing field when it comes to stand-up, and he knows it. That man can never look me in the eyes and said, I would stand with you. He's going to immediately magnetize on my crotch and do what he does, you know. Avoid the fight at all costs, but we're ready for that.
In his prime, his chin and overall ability to take damage was damn near unparalleled, and his boxing fundamentals were a constant throughout his time in the top flight. Jorge was practically impossible to finish. His defensive skills were truly awesome, and when he did get his rhythm, good luck catching up. But it's not just the skills he has that made him a nightmare matchup. No, one of the biggest tools that defined Jorge's resurrection period in particular was his confidence. The confidence that came from his incredible resume. This dude dude fought absolutely everyone. Many of the greatest lightweights and welterweights of all time stood across from Jorge at one point or another. And so, if you do sign on the dotted line to take this dude on, how the hell are you supposed to intimidate him? This man has quite literally seen and done it all. So the idea of any of his opponents finding a crack in his mental armor is unlikely. Jorge comes from the streets, guys. There's no breaking him down. But when you sign a contract to take this dude on, you're not just fighting him. No, you're taking on the entire city of Miami and his legions of fans across the globe. It might have seemed unlikely in his early years, but Jorge somehow grew into one of the biggest crossover sensations in the sport, a genuine pay-per-view draw that burst into the public eye with a string of viral moments. KOing Darren Till, attacking Leon Edwards, his record-breaking KO of Ben Askren, the BMF battle with Nate Diaz. It all combined to turn Jorge Masvidal into a bona fide superstar. And like fighting any major figure within the sport, a fight with an A-list star like him is never quite as simple as you would hope. You might be good on the regional scene. Hell, you might even make it decently far in the UFC. But fighting a massive superstar is entirely different, and Jorge certainly fits that bill. Everything comes bigger when you're in that pay-per-view position. The media attention grows, the press conferences become more intense, and when the time to step into the octagon comes, who knows how drained you might have become after the fight week that came before. The biggest stars are used to it. Guys like Conor McGregor, Khabib Nurmagomedov, and in this case, Jorge. They can just slip into their role with little to no issue. But many fighters who sign up to fight a major figure have absolutely no experience with anything remotely close to what they're about to live through. And when the fighting starts, any level of pressure you're feeling could be used against you.
Touch him up in the chin. If he's still there after I touch him up in the chin, we'll work the body and we'll go back to the chin. We'll win the wrestling scrambles. We'll win the clinch work. And he'll just get tired from the damage that we're putting out. I have one of the best gas tanks in this division.
Jorge's finishing ability has come on in a huge way in recent years. Gone are the days of leaving it to the judges. No, this man is an absolute assassin most of the time, and he proved that beyond any doubt during the latter half of his career.
At playing with the distance, I've really jotted down at the distance, so I would rank him dangerous in both the stand-up and the ground, but also at the same time a very fitting style for myself, you know.
Fighting a guy like Masvidal raises your chances of ending up on his highlight reel significantly, and that is a risk that most athletes would rather not take unless absolutely necessary. If Gamebred sees an opponent, you'd best believe he's going to be perfectly equipped to take it. With Masvidal now happily retired, one of the toughest nights out in the business will no longer be able to terrorize his divisions. And while he did lose to three of the division's very best to close out his career in Kamaru Usman, Colby Covington, and Gilbert Burns, the man's legend is well and truly set in stone. Only time will tell if his own pursuit of fight promotion with Gamebred Boxing will result in a post-fight career that lives up to the hype. But after a successful show earlier this year that featured a host of combat icons, we'd certainly bet on it. From his tough and gritty background to his total transformation into a legitimate knockout artist, it's pretty easy to see why these fighters should have every reason to be scared of Jorge Masvidal.